My name is Nader Hashmi. I teach Middle East politics at the School of Foreign Service, and this lecture series is co-sponsored by 4 units at Georgetown University, the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, our Africa Studies program, and our campus in Doha. Next Tuesday, we have a panel discussion that will mark the first anniversary of the Israel-Gaza war. All details about our lecture series and events can be obtained from our website. Most of the speakers that we're bringing in as part of the Gaza lecture series will also be doing an evening event in downtown Washington, D.C. at Busboys and Poets, including our guest speaker today, Nathan Thrall. Nathan Thrall won the 2024 Pulitzer Prize in General Nonfiction for his book, A Day in the Life of Abd Salama, an Anatomy of a Jerusalem Tragedy, on sale here in this room over on the side. He's also the author of The Only Language They Understand, Forcing Compromise in Israel-Palestine. His essays and writings have been published in the New York Times, The Guardian, the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, and they've been translated into more than 12 languages. He spent a decade working at the International Crisis Group, where he was the director of the Arab-Israeli Project. He's taught at Bard College. He's originally from California, and he currently lives in Jerusalem. Our discussant today is Sarah Leah Whitson. She's the executive director of Democracy in the Arab World Now, DAWN, an organization that was established by the late Jamal Khashoggi. Previously, she served as the executive director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa division from 2004 until 2020, and she's led dozens of advocacy and investigative missions throughout the Middle East, focusing on issues related to human rights. She's also published widely in the field of human rights and foreign policy. In light of recent events in Gaza, Israel, and now in Lebanon, I cannot think of 2 people who I would like to hear more from with respect to an interpretation and an assessment of recent events in the region. While this event is formally titled Gaza, Israel's System of Domination and U.S. Complicity, we'll also be exploring events in Lebanon because they're both topical and, of course, they're deeply linked to events that are happening in Gaza. The format is going to be very informal. Sarah and Nathan are going to simply have a conversation. We're all going to listen in. Afterwards, we'll open the floor to Q&A, and I'll talk about the Q&A rules in a moment. As moderator, I might interject and pose a few questions to broaden the conversation, and then we hope to end at the latest by 1:30. So let me just begin. I guess I'll start the conversation and get you, both of you, to talk among yourselves. The big question that obviously everyone is thinking about now and contemplating is the meaning and significance of the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the Israeli incursion in Lebanon, what that means for the future of the Israel-Palestine conflict, the Middle East more broadly. So maybe, Nathan, you can start with some sort of general thoughts, take as much time as you want, then we'll turn to Sarah Leah.
So I think that basically what we've seen over the last half year is can really be characterized with one word: impunity. And what we have seen in a series of Israeli attacks, including on the Iranian diplomatic facility in Damascus in the spring, followed by a highly telegraphed retaliation that appeared to be largely for show by Iran, followed by assassinations of senior Hezbollah commanders, is just an Israeli escalation of further and further attacks. And there is a sense of euphoria right now in Israel over the successes of these attacks, when over 500 were killed in Lebanon last week. The Israeli defense minister said today was a masterpiece. And I think that's really reflective of the general mood inside of Israel. There had been warnings for a long time that a direct confrontation with Hezbollah escalating out of this very low-scale war of attrition that's existed for the last year would be very dangerous for Israel, that Hezbollah is so much stronger than Hamas, and that Israel could rely on entire towns and cities suffering major damage because Hezbollah's capabilities are so much greater, and because they have precision-guided munitions that can penetrate Israeli defenses. And what has actually proven to be the case is, again, impunity. Escalation after escalation after escalation, and virtually nothing in response, which is, of course, whetting the appetite for more escalation. And the real worry now is what will happen with respect to Iran, and will Israel find a way to attack Iran directly at this moment where they feel they have quote unquote escalation dominance. Iran has very few options. The US is backing Israel fully. And this has been, if you listen to US officials themselves, they say for years Israel's goal has been to drag us into a war with Iran. And now that appears to be closer than ever.
I guess I would largely concur with Nathan's remarks. I think on October 9, I tweeted when Israel first launched its attack on Gaza, was that this is a war that may be starting in Israel-Palestine, but it will end in Iran. And my very firm assessment was that Israel's design from the get-go was to expand this war to take on Iran, quote unquote, once and for all. And I don't think Israeli officials made any secret about this. Netanyahu, Israeli defense ministers, members of Israel's war cabinet have repeatedly insisted that all of this is about Iran, that the attack that happened by Hamas on October 7 was about Iran, that Hezbollah's attacks are about Iran. Everything is about Iran. I think this serves two purposes. Number one, it serves to distract from the extermination campaign underway in Gaza, and what we will see very soon is a forcible displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank. They might be shifted around the West Bank. As many of them who can leave will leave. But this is a process that's unfolding with virtually zero international media coverage, because Israel has made sure to prohibit international journalists from entering Gaza, and has increasingly made it very difficult, if not impossible, for them now to even enter the West Bank. Second of all, this is, in fact, its goal. They saw this attack, this Hamas attack, and the war that would start, believing that they would have global sympathy, which they did following October 7, to use that to their advantage to achieve their aim, their ultimate aim, and these are not my words, but the Israeli government's, to take down Iran once and for all, which they believe to be effectively the last remaining threat to Israeli hegemony in all of historic Palestine. And, if you look at some of the language that's coming out, some are proposing additional chunks from Jordan and additional chunks from Lebanon as well. I think that the United States, or the US officials in charge of foreign policy decision-making, some of them have supported Israel's efforts and Israel's plans all along. And that has led to some of the polarization that we've seen in the Biden administration. So not just about the atrocities in Gaza with over 40,000 dead, and believe me, that number will exceed 200,000 as sure as I sit here and speak these words. But also those angry that, surprise, surprise, the Israeli regime has refused every single effort by the Biden administration, at least their public rhetorical statements, to calm down, don't carry out an incursion, don't go into Gaza, don't attack Lebanon, don't escalate. And every single time Israel has made clear that it will do whatever it wants, that it believes serves its interests and purposes. I would invite all of you to approach the reporting today in major American press that Israel is imminently going to attack Iran in a large-scale massive attack using ballistic missiles, and remind you all of the similar threats and lies we heard about Iraq and its weapons of mass destruction. And I will...
You flipped it. You meant to say that Iran will imminently attack Israel.
Is that what? Yeah. Yes, sorry. That's what I meant. Second, also to consider that such news will serve to justify a preemptive Israeli attack on Iran, because the news will be, oh, well, of course they have to respond to this imminent attack from Iran, just as the United States preemptively attacked Iraq to destroy its non-existent weapons of mass destruction. So please, please, please look at this information skeptically. Unfortunately, our government has been engaged in putting out false information, exaggerated information, a lot of information often based on Israeli intelligence and information. So could be true, could not be true, but we do not have any neutral objective parties offering the American people neutral objective information.
Go ahead. Well, I just wanted to follow up on something that a phrase that you just used, which is polarization in the Biden administration. So clearly, as in any administration, there are a host of views. Some people are more hawkish, some people less. To what extent should we actually care about those differences? Do they matter? Ultimately, you know, the explanation that I've heard from the members of the administration for what they've done is essentially to say, well, you have the most pro-Israel Democrat that you could imagine in power, and everything derives from that, and there's very little that people below can do, and the ones just below are aligned with him, and so I'm curious to hear what you think. You know, should we care about those differences?
I would say they're tremendously important to understand and examine and study and highlight on two levels. First of all, the divisions within the Biden administration to some extent reflect some of the divisions that we've seen in the American public. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that there's been a massive shift in US public opinion with regards to Israel, with a majority of Americans now supporting cutting aid to Israel. That's historic. That's never happened before. And there's only one party who created that reality, and that's Israel itself in terms of its atrocities in Gaza. So, you know, I would say it's a positive sign to see public sentiments filtering into what should be a democratic government representing the views and desires and wishes of the American people. What I find more troubling is that the fact that increasing numbers of Americans oppose US military aid to Israel, despite the fact that in some states, the Biden administration is risking the re-election of a Democrat because it refuses to change its policies on Israel, you know, exposes a danger in our own country, exposes the corruption of our own operation of our government, where, particularly in foreign policy, more than anything else, it's an extremely small, elite decision-making process that is virtually immunized and completely ignores actual American public opinion, and is exclusively attuned to its donors, not its voters. And that's literally the choice that the Biden administration is making now. It's choosing its donors over its voters. And we'll see if those voters are strong enough to impose a cost on the Democratic Party. My own view is that the Democratic Party will not change its position on Israel, which is, you know, very slightly actually different from the Republican parties, until and unless they experience some pain and a cost, including losing an election.
I agree with that. But you mentioned this phrase that, you know, seeing these divisions in the American public reflected in the administration. And I wonder to what extent that really is the case, because, you know, I have asked people in the administration, to what extent do you feel the base is shifting? And the answer is basically, it's not reaching this level. And so it's obvious that there, despite the polling numbers that you just mentioned, it's not anywhere being considered to cut military aid to Israel. in the Biden administration. So so isn't there a huge disconnect actually between the public opinion and the policy?
There's a huge disconnect because foreign policy is the most elite, exclusive, non-diverse area of US policy decision-making. There's not another issue in which the publics, the communities, the people from states are not involved, whether it's abortion, whether it's the environment, whether it's fossil fuels, whether it's gun control. These are issues Americans actively debate and, sort of get into all kinds of free zones about. Israel is the one issue where we have that debate largely silenced within the top decision makers of the government. And I don't really think it's about Biden being a Zionist. I don't know how engaged he's actually in the policies. I think it's more because Amos Hochstein, Brett McGurk, Secretary Blinken,
Sullivan.
And Jake Sullivan, but especially these three, are very, very firmly and staunchly not only in the pro-Zionist camp, but in the pro-Arab dictator camp. That is their sort of point of view, and that's their comfort zone, to sit around with Gulf dictators, cutting deals with Israeli officials. And everything that we talk about outside of that, sadly, doesn't reach them. But there have been 14 resignations from the Biden administration of senior and mid-level public officials. And we know from all the dissent chats that there is real polarization and division within its own staff. So, this is going to be a process because of the stranglehold of donor money in our political system. I think a natural democratic process would have created more change in US policy with respect to Israel already. But because American foreign policy in Israel is stunted and corrupted, it's harder.
Yeah. So now that we're talking about US foreign policy, in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, Antony Blinken has written the lead essay where he's basically taken a victory lap over all of the accomplishments that the Biden administration has achieved globally. On the Middle East, he's written the following. I want to read the quote because it's standard framing that we hear and get you both to comment on it. So this is what Antony Blinken writes on the Middle East in his recent essay. Quote, the Biden administration is working tirelessly with partners in the Middle East and beyond to end the conflict and suffering in Gaza, find a diplomatic solution that enables Israelis and Lebanese to live in safety on both sides of the border, manage the risk of a wider regional war, and work toward greater integration and normalization in the region, including between Israel and Saudi Arabia. These efforts are interdependent, Blinken writes. Without an end to the war in Gaza and a time-bound, credible path to statehood that addresses the Palestinians' legitimate aspirations and Israel's security needs, normalization cannot move forward. But if these efforts succeed, normalization could join Israel to the regional security architecture and unlock economic opportunities across the region, isolate Iran and its glimmers of such integration were on display in the coalition of countries, including Arab states, that helped Israel defend itself against an unprecedented direct attack from Iran in April. My visits to the region since October the 7th have affirmed that there is a path toward greater peace and integration if leaders there are willing to make the hard decisions. So this is what we hear repeatedly. This is a summary of the standard narrative that comes out of the Biden administration and the US State Department. Sarah, how do you respond?
I mean, it's embarrassing. It's laughable. It's farcical. This is the equivalent of Jake Sullivan telling us on October 1, 2023, that the Biden administration had succeeded in bringing peace and stability to the Middle East. I mean, they have made themselves a laughingstock of the whole world, not only because of their absolute F-grade diplomacy with the Israelis, who went and killed the lead Palestinian negotiator. Oops, no ceasefire, surprise. But also this, this fantastic view, this fantastic notion, which we see the evidence as being a complete failure of, that apartheid Israel is going to normalize with a sociopathic dictator in Saudi Arabia, and that's going to bring peace and stability to the region. I mean, there's no logical sense to it. And I can't understand why Secretary Blinken would embarrass himself this way. Really would better to just be silent about this. The reality is that on this issue of Israel's normalization in the Middle East, this has been the #1 priority, not only of the Trump administration, but also of the Biden administration. And they have, in the most generous sense, I would say, actually deluded themselves into believing that this might be a formula for success. You know, I don't know if any of you saw Jared Kushner, foreign policy expert now, put a long tweet out celebrating the assassination of Hezbollah leader Nasrallah, as well as the pager attacks that caused thousands of civilian injuries, saying, you know, this is a pivotal moment in the Middle East, and now we're really going to bring peace and stability. It's literally like, don't believe what you're seeing in front of your eyes. Just trust us. This is going to bring peace and stability. I mean, honestly, it's hard to even take what you just read seriously and to give it a real serious response, because it's absurd.
You want to comment?
I mean, I think Sarah Leah is so well spoken. I really have nothing to add. I would just say, you know, the administration knows, if we're talking about, he's emphasizing these efforts at a ceasefire, you know, the #1 issue all along in the ceasefire negotiations over Gaza has been that Hamas has wanted an actual ceasefire, meaning a permanent ceasefire, and a withdrawal of Israeli troops. And Israel has refused on both counts, and everything else is noise. That is the impasse. And for months, the administration, especially Blinken, have been selling false optimism about these negotiations over and over again. It's 90% of the way there. It's about to happen. I mean, we've been led, you know, with this carrot in front of us, like a donkey with a carrot in front of us for months. It reminds me of the peace process. You know, 2 states, it's coming, it's around the corner, this occupation's temporary. And it's the same thing with these ceasefire negotiations, when they themselves know and will privately blame Israel for refusing the very reasonable demand that a ceasefire is an actual ceasefire, and not that Israel has permission to go and bombard Gaza the day after a prisoner exchange. So in the very recent days, you've seen a couple of unnamed administration officials telling the Wall Street Journal, and I think another source, there's not going to be any ceasefire deal before January or in the foreseeable future. And I regard that as a positive development, that they're finally admitting that and saying that publicly. And even from their own, you know, narrow interests, they're working against themselves, because they believe that pressure from the hostage families in Israel is the only possible chance of getting Israel to agree to any kind of deal. And by selling this false optimism that the deal is around the corner, they're actually crushing the activism that would put pressure on the government. So yeah, it has been a farce, their policy, and obviously all of this, you know, talk of how they're restraining Israel and so on and so forth. You know, they could end this war. They could have ended this war months ago, by cutting off arms. That's it. Israel could, in the first weeks of this war, Israel needed airlifts of weapons, and it's entirely in the US's power, and has been all along, to end this war. And they are fully responsible, and they act as though they're bystanders who would like to give good advice to an ally about some conflict they have nothing to do with. It's our weapons, it's our tax dollars. We have the ability to stop it.
The question here is, you know, what's the calculation from Washington? You send your top diplomat there, you invest 2 or 3 months. Everyone knows that Netanyahu is not serious, but you're still going through the motions. So that doesn't make sense. The other thing that doesn't make sense is, you know, Biden comes into office saying he wants to withdraw or reduce the American footprint in the Middle East. He wants to pivot to Asia and focus on China. But because of the inability to restrain Netanyahu, the United States is getting dragged into the region militarily, politically. The war is expanding, and there's no ability or interest to establish any consequences for how does this help America's perceived now? Let's leave the ethics aside, right? We're just talking about naked, realpolitik calculations. It raises a lot of questions that don't have easy answers. What's the end game here? What's the calculation? How does this help the United States in any ways? It certainly doesn't help, the allies or the dictators that the United States is supporting, because their populations are watching this horror show and they're getting frustrated, mostly in Jordan, where it's the weak link in the chain. But so I mean, how long is this going to go? And now you began your comment, Sarah. He's going to bomb Netanyahu is going to bomb Iran. How does this help U.S. interests in the region? Any insight on sort of what the powers that be in the White House are actually thinking and calculating?
You will never find a reasonable answer to that question of how the war in Gaza, how Israel's war in Lebanon, how U.S. military aid, now exceeding $20 billion in 2024, serves the American interest. And the reason is it doesn't serve the American interest. And I think many, many people, I don't want to say most, but many, many people know that. The irony is that when you talk to the administration about complying with international law, complying with the orders of the International Court of Justice, which has ordered Israel to end its illegal occupation and ordered member states around the world to stop assisting, including sending weapons, in support of Israel and its occupation, they said, well, we have to be realpolitik and we can't always abide by our values. We have our interests. But when you talk about our interests, it's our thumping heart of values that we have to talk about in Israel, because it's the only democracy in the Middle East rising from the ashes of the Holocaust. Nothing about interests, right? If you start with the premise that with respect to Israel, our government decision makers are captive to donations, massive donations, and Nathan can tell you all about this, to both political parties, that rewards them if they continue to supply Israel with all the weapons to fight this war, including U.S. troops to fight their wars, including launching an illegal war against Yemen to fight this war. No congressional authorization for U.S. attacks on Yemen. Then it makes sense. These are not calculations that the Biden administration is making based on U.S. national security interests. It's making it in the interests of election and re-election of Democratic candidates. Because if you're a Democrat who speaks critically of Israel, look at what they did to Cori Bush. Look at what they did to Jamal Bowman. That's what they're afraid of. It's short-term mercantile calculations that is driving this decision-making. It's fear and weakness that is driving this, because, well, what's going to happen? What are they going to say if we criticize Netanyahu too much? We're going to be punished here. All of the incentive system in American politics rewards politicians who do more for Israel and punishes politicians who question that. If we don't tackle that incentive structure, American policy with respect to Israel is going to continue to not make sense.
Agree with that 100%.
Let's shift back to Lebanon and deal with some arguments I'd like you to respond to that are very much in the mainstream of the public debate over what's happening right now. So if you listen to the mainstream Israeli position and American position on what's happening in Lebanon right now, it goes like this. Israel was minding its business. Then on October the 8th, rocket fire and missile fire started to come from Lebanon onto Israel, and 60,000 Israeli residents in the north have had to flee. And so Israel is exercising its right to self-defense by going after the people responsible for this rocket fire. How long is this supposed to go on? That's effectively, in a nutshell, the position. That's why there's a ground invasion or incursion. How would you respond to that narrative?
I think that's a better one for you.
I mean, quite obviously, this war didn't start on October 7. This war against Palestinians has been underway at least since 1967, because a military occupation is a state of war. We have to understand that the military occupation of Palestinian territories is an act of war, because you are using your military forces to subjugate, occupy, and control a population that is not yours in perpetuity, without basic human rights, without certainly any political rights, and with regular, routine, gross violations of the laws of war. The International Criminal Court's case about war crimes in Palestine since 2014 that didn't start on October 7. The prosecution of Israeli war crimes didn't start on October 8. There has been an incessant state of war, as I said, at least since 1967. And Palestinians in Gaza, in particular, have been living under an illegal blockade and siege, which has caused the Palestinian population there tremendous suffering. And, you know, what I have repeatedly told Israelis with whom I discuss this, and of course, American policymakers who represent them, is Israel will never have a military solution to the question of Palestine unless it actually exterminates every last Palestinian.
Or expels.
Or expels, but if they're just at the border or across the border, I don't think it's going to go away. Maybe if they disperse them to Germany and Australia, which I'm sure they would very much love to do, that will, in fact, end the Palestinian movement. But as long as Palestinians are living and breathing under Israeli military occupation, of course they're going to resist. And if you don't give them legal means to resist, and if the international community persists in defying the orders of the International Court of Justice, when the ambassador of the United States, the United Nations, openly declares that she and the United States will defy an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court and refuse ever to arrest Netanyahu, what recourse are the Palestinians going to have? Unfortunately, we're going to continue to see heinous attacks on Israelis, because no people is going to accept living under military subjugation forever, in perpetuity.
Nathan, when we were talking before the event started in my office, I asked you just a general question that I think it would be good for the audience to hear. You live in Jerusalem now, in the middle of this sort of horrific moment, transformative moment. You know, many Palestinians are viewing this as a second Nakba. The ripple effects of this conflict in Gaza are now affecting the region. You're living in the middle of this situation. What's it like to live in Jerusalem today at this particular moment?
So the most striking thing, I think, for anyone here, if they were to visit Jerusalem right now, is that in the Jewish neighborhoods of Jerusalem, you cannot feel that there is a war. You would not know that there's a war in Gaza 45 minutes away. You would not know that there's a war in Lebanon. Schools are in session, cafes are full, streets are full, everything is absolutely normal. And that is one of the keys to the longevity of this system of domination over Palestinians, is that it is very easy to live your life as an Israeli Jew and not think about it and not feel it. It's right next to you, and you can ignore it very, very easily. And you know, you mentioned a second Nakba. You know, we have now more Palestinians forcibly displaced than during the Nakba, and we have more death than we've ever seen in Israel-Palestine. So while that is happening, you have Israelis carrying on in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv as though nothing is happening.
On that point, one of the sort of shocking sort of developments over the last 11 months is how, when you look at the polls in Israel, that the vast majority of Israeli who are polled either supports what Israel is doing in Gaza or wants it more intensified.
That's right.
That's sort of shocking. How do you explain that?
I think that there is a thirst for revenge. I think that Israelis, and particularly Israeli men, feel humiliated and demasculinized by October 7th. And that what we're witnessing since then is an enormous campaign of revenge.
And so how do things turn for the better?
I mean, I also think that October 7th kind of took off the pretext of much of what you hear from the Israeli center left, and also from, you know, the U.S. policymakers, the Western diplomatic community, which is a framing of Israel-Palestine that's all about the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. That is the central issue. And I have to say, to its credit, the Israeli right does not actually hold that view. And it understands that the conflict is about the takeover of Palestine by Israeli Jews, and it's about 1948, and it's about Zionism. And I think that for many Israelis, what October 7th did was bring them closer to the right's understanding. And there is a very widespread view that it is about all the land from the river to the sea. It's us or them. It's eliminationist. And I think that's really what's behind those polling numbers. And I don't think you didn't need much to get people there. I think that was beneath the surface prior to October 7th. But now it's out in the open.
I've always thought that the sort of ironclad green light that the United States has consistently given to Israel for a very long time has emboldened this trend within Israel. That had there been some guardrails, had there been some consequences, it might have forced perhaps some sort of serious debate that we just can't carry on this way. Our biggest ally is not going to support us. To what extent do you believe that's a factor in this right-wing sort of hawkish turn within Israeli politics in recent decades?
I think it's a huge factor. And, you know, so much of the conversation from American secretaries of state and other leaders, it's always been, it is inevitable that Israel is going to one day have to choose. Israel can't, it's unsustainable. How many times have we heard it's unsustainable? Israel has to choose one day, it's inevitable. And by the way, that inevitability means I don't have to worry about my own culpability for this thing that is actually quite permanent, a state of subjugation. So it's inevitable, this is temporary, it's going to end, and it's inevitable that Israel is going to have to give Palestinians their liberty, either through the establishment of a state on 22% of their homeland in the Gaza and the West Bank, or through citizenship and equal rights. But it simply cannot continue in this way. But it can continue in this way, and it has continued in this way, and it can continue in this way precisely because of this strong shield that the US provides. Weapons, arms, UN Security Council vetoes, and all kinds of diplomatic protection. So if that were to change, then you would see Israel slide toward becoming an actual pariah state. And they would start to have to recalculate. They wouldn't have visa-free travel to the United States. They wouldn't, you know, be in Russia wasn't in the Olympics. Israel wouldn't be in the Olympics. They wouldn't be in FIFA. And they would start to actually think that this has a price, because right now it has no price. And so if you ever want to have a serious conversation about one state or two state, have it. But have it at a point where Israel actually has to decide, because it doesn't have to. That's a fantastical conversation, so long as the whole world is saying carte blanche for continuing this other path, expanding Israeli Jewish settlements, constricting Palestinians into tighter spaces, perpetual war.
Yep. And that point really highlights the importance of the United States of America in this question. Trying to shift policy, do whatever can be done, because if there is a serious shift in policy, I mean, I was optimistic if Bernie Sanders would have become the president, then there might have been serious consequences. And that ship has largely sailed. But what you're saying now sort of highlights how really the solution to some sort of just resolution of Israel-Palestine lies in this country, not anywhere else. Would you agree with that?
I think the importance of the United States cannot be overstated. I don't think in the end, I don't think it's going to rely on the US alone. I think that you need a combination of things, as you did in South Africa. I think you need a sense that the territory is ungovernable, combined with the removal of the US shield. Those two things together can end it. One on its own probably can't.
Sarah?
I actually want to ask Nathan a question as well that I've been wanting to ask. I don't know if this is a good segue for that. Nathan, your book was written before October 7th.
Yeah.
And it told a profoundly moving story of the experience of a Palestinian family whose very young son was killed in a school bus accident. In effect, the Israelis didn't kill him. I wonder if you can reflect on the world you wrote about before October 7 and your goal, I think, in helping people understand what life under occupation is like versus now.
Yeah.
Whether with 40,000, soon to be 200,000 dead Palestinians and no end in sight, did you even imagine that the reality could become this much worse?
So, I wrote this book out of a sense of despair. I was working for an NGO for a decade, the International Crisis Group. A lot of my writing was for experts. It was for policymakers, politicians, journalists, analysts, and ambassadors who were stationed there. And I was watching as the Palestinian issue was steadily sinking in global priorities, except when you had a war in Gaza, where it would, or some major event in the West Bank, where it would spike momentarily and you'd have mobilization in London and other capitals, and then it would disappear. And basically the world had grown numb to the plight of the Palestinians, and Blinken's celebration of the normalization agreements, which were sealing the fate of Palestinians to be perpetually subjugated, was something celebrated around the world, and so what I really felt needed to be done was to, shake people out of that numbness by moving away from generalities and abstractions and statistics and really just telling a very specific human story. And that also came from a philosophical change that I had about how to bring about change on this issue. And I had so many conversations with people, some of them who are now in the Biden administration, where they told me privately, I actually am convinced by the things that you're writing. I believe that the occupation is not temporary. I believe this state of subjugation is going to continue indefinitely. I believe Israel is succeeding. I believe that it looks like a slow motion colonization with no end in sight. And we, the US government, are a big part of why that is the case. And so long as we don't change, that's not going to change. However, I am not going to say anything different, and I'm not going to do anything different. Why? Because the space for me to make a change, the kinds of change I could make, are so tiny and incremental you, Nathan, would laugh at them. And even that tiny thing, I could lose my job, my career, my reputation, at the very least, months-long headache. And why? Why would I do that? I'm not going to do that. And so I decided that I didn't want to do the work of being in dialogue with people who privately tell me nice things and don't act any differently. I want to try and change the public atmosphere that they operate in so that they could maybe begin to start acting on what they privately believe. And so that was the idea of switching my career and telling a narrative. And yes, I believe that with this level of Israeli impunity, with the world growing numb to Israel's expansion, of course, we're going to see tremendous bloodshed. I didn't think it would be, 40,000 in the course of half a year, but I knew that we would see lots more bloodshed, and we still will. When after this Gaza ceasefire is over, the apartheid's still going to be in place. It'll be direct Israeli control in Gaza rather than controlling it from the outside, and there's going to be a lot more bloodshed.
That's a great question, Sarah, that you asked. Thank you. Let's see if we can get a similar quality of questions from our audience, who's been sitting very patiently. There's a microphone there, so anyone who wants to ask a question, please line up behind the microphone. And the emphasis is on a question. If you go beyond a minute, I will have to interrupt you. So, first question, Nigar, go ahead.
Thank you, Nathan. Great to see you. I first met you 10 years ago in Jerusalem during another conflict. I want to ask you about media coverage, and I'm sorry, I missed a little bit of the beginning of the event, so if this was discussed, but how do you assess the media coverage, especially the Western media, and particularly the US, but English-speaking media, if you want to look at it general, of the conflict? I mean, that is developing and expanding as we speak today, with headlines coming on all of our devices, into a new front in Lebanon. Sort of the double standard that audiences in the global South have been, alerting and talking about, and also the disservice, I think, that the coverage does to the general public in these countries in the West, mainly in the US, I would say, who don't understand what and why their government is putting this unconditional support and funding and arms and all of diplomatic support behind. And I just want to quote a Lebanese journalist who messaged me today, basically saying everything that you're hearing and reading in the American media, as he said, quote unquote, is bullshit. So just throwing that out there. Thanks.
Thank you. Good to see you. I think that obviously I think that the US mainstream media coverage of Israel-Palestine is terrible, full stop. I think that it is changing, it's moving in the right direction, but it still has a very, very long way to go. And I could give you countless examples, little things that seem little, but they accumulate. They're embedded in almost every sentence of a piece. And, a non-expert doesn't really know it, and they trust these sources. And I think the worst part is that they don't even know that they're biased. The worst part is that they actually think that they're objective, and they don't understand that so many of their premises are, broadly speaking, a liberal Zionist worldview that you breathe in as an American growing up, whether you're a Jew or not. And that's just that is the mainstream view, and it's filled with false equivalence between subjugator and subjugated, and it's everywhere, and it's also in tiny little things. Like, for example, the New York Times. It is constantly writing that there are, very recently, I can point to numerous examples recently, that there are 500,000 settlers. False. There are over 700,000 settlers. Why are they saying 500,000? Because Israel annexed in 1967 East Jerusalem and the lands of over 24 surrounding villages. And so as far as the state of Israel is concerned, all of the settlers in those annexed areas, an annexation that no one recognizes, including the US government, it's occupied territory as far as the whole world is concerned, including the US. But for Israel, it's been annexed, so they're not settlers. They're living in the sovereign state of Israel. And so these journalists are, without even realizing it, de facto accepting the Israeli annexation of East Jerusalem, which their own State Department doesn't do. And they don't even realize these kinds of biases that are in, as I say, every article, every sentence.
Why is that? Why don't they not realize it?
I think that they're ignorant. I don't think that there is I don't think for the most part there are ideological people, et cetera. But I don't think for the most part it's people who know what I just said and are deliberately saying, no, but I don't count East Jerusalem settlers as settlers. I think it's just, they hear it from other people. They seem mainstream. They say there are 500,000. Oh, other people say we treat East Jerusalem settlements as neighborhoods. We don't call them settlements. We call them neighborhoods. They're just entering a culture. They hear a lingo and they're regurgitating it.
Next question.
If I could just
Yeah, go ahead. Before the next, go ahead, Sarah.
Got my microphone. In terms of media coverage, Negar, and I think you know as well as I do, if not better, I think I would be even harsher in my criticism than Nathan, who's far more polite than I am. It's been awful. Do you remember nearly every major media in America repeated the lies of beheaded babies? Our own president repeated the lies of beheaded babies. Do you remember the New York Times filing an unbelievably easily dismantled, evidence-free, massive, bells and whistles, publicity, videos, report about the so-called systematic rape by Hamas? Absolutely false. Zero truth to that. And yet they were so eager to conjure up the most horrible atrocities that they repeated easily dismantled lies, falling, very much in line, again, exactly like they did with weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It's like they learned nothing. So I would say that there is a lot of ideological element to a number of the writers and publishers and editors at places like the New York Times. CNN, two leading correspondents, Jake Tapper and Dana Stroul, repeatedly repeated the lie that Rashida Tlaib had called out the Attorney General of Michigan for persecuting her because she's Jewish. Those words were never said. And yet, not only did they repeatedly broadcast that on mainstream television media, a number of Congress members followed up to demand that Rashida be removed from Congress for something she never said. So I think that, unfortunately, many in the American media, certainly some of the most prominent voices, have been reckless and irresponsible. And if they had done this, if they had made these mistakes in any other context, they would all be fired by now.
I just want to say on the ideological thing, I agree that they're ideological, but I distinguish between a person who's really ideological and knows it and grew up, with love of Israel and we have to defend Israel and we can't criticize Israel and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And somebody who, let's say, has no stake in it, just grew up as an American and is ideological without knowing that they're ideological, because that's the mainstream view.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. Next question.
Yeah, thank you guys. I wanted to frame my question around the sort of role that the Israeli public played and is playing in the genocide. Like it seems odd that to think that Netanyahu doesn't have some sort of support for expansionism. I mean, over the last couple of days, we saw in the Jerusalem Post a questioning of whether southern Lebanon is a part of the Promised Land, and so and also to continue, the military actions, be they be in Gaza or the expansion of the military operation in southern Lebanon. Where does the Israeli public play into this? And if there was a sort of kind of protest, if it was majoritarian in ending it, I this is something that I kind of struggle with, to think that there is actually a larger population within the Israeli public that is against expansionism within Israel and the military operations. So you can speak on it, whether between like the settlers in the West Bank, like that's what I want to see. Like, is it ideological on two sets of front, the Judea and Samaria state, as Ilan Pappé calls it, or Tel Aviv and Israel proper? Like, what's the population? What's their perception of this? What do they favor? What they don't favor in terms of expansionism and the continuation of a genocide in Gaza and ethnic cleansing? It's a loaded question.
You spoke to this already when I asked you a question, but now just to push that a bit further, there's strong support for going into Lebanon among the Israeli public. Yeah. So are there any distinctions, I guess the question is asking, between public opinion on this new policy that Netanyahu is pursuing?
So definitely there's widespread support for what Israel's doing in Lebanon. But I think if I understand your question correctly, I think that it's really about what is the Israeli support for a broader expansionist project, including in the West Bank, and potentially, resettling Gaza. And I think it is a complex thing to answer, because on the one hand, every single Israeli government, left, right, and center, since the occupation began, has expanded the settlement project. And so that's kind of an unequivocal answer for you. There is, there's so much focus in the discourse in the US about Netanyahu. Will he survive? Won't he survive? Who cares? This system of control is going to be in place, whether he's there or someone else is there. We just a few years ago had a government without Netanyahu, with Lapid and Bennett, and they were behaving exactly the same way toward the Palestinians. And they were expanding Israeli Jewish settlements. So I think that on a political level, you can say that, definitely the settlement project is not a partisan issue. It is the number one project of the state of Israel. And every aspect of the Israeli government is involved in it. The Israeli Ministry of Transportation is paving the roads in the West Bank. There's this story that's portrayed of these crazies. They go, the government doesn't really want them to. They go, they take over a hilltop, they put on some caravans. It's embarrassing for the government. They twist the government's arm, and they succeed, as this like minority interest group that is manipulating the system. And that is totally false. This is the entire Israeli government, executive, legislative, judicial, that's behind the settlement project. At the same time, if you go to Tel Aviv and you ask, poll people in the Tel Aviv area, secular Israeli upper middle class people, do they like settlements? Do they support the expansion of settlements? Many, many, many of them would say no. But do they care enough to stop it? Absolutely not. And so when you have, mass protests against the judicial reform, this was such a clarifying thing, because you got hundreds of thousands of Israeli Jews coming out exactly this sociological group that I'm talking about, the greater Tel Aviv area, upper middle class, largely secular, they felt when their personal interests as Jews were at stake because they worried about a theocratic slide that would harm their own rights, they were out in the streets in huge numbers. You've never had mobilization like that for the people who actually have been held without basic civil rights for over 57 years. And even within those protests, it was so ironic, these anti-judicial reform protests, the headline of those protests was preserving Israeli democracy. And the people who were attending, there was this phenomenon of everybody was doing Zoom classes at night where they were like listening to lectures from experts on constitutional law and like learning about the importance of the judiciary in different governments around the world. And it was all about educating yourself about the principles of democracy. And yet within these crowds, how many of the people were talking about, hey, actually, this is a state with 7 million Jews, 7 million Palestinians under its control. The vast majority of them don't have basic civil rights. That doesn't meet any definition of democracy. We aren't a democracy. Shouldn't we be talking about all these people millions of people who don't have rights on the basis of their inborn characteristics? No, they were totally marginal and largely irrelevant in those protests.
We have two questions in the room, and there's one online, and then I think we're going to have to wrap it up then. So go ahead.
Hi, thank you for being here. I wanted to ask you about your other book, which we got The Only Language They Understand. And in that book, you sort of make the argument that in periods of peace and security are when Israel is like the least likely to make concessions and is the most likely to pursue, this sort of expansionary approach. But I think one thing that makes me really sad is after October 7th, as you've talked about, the Israeli public has seemed to have moved to the right on all of these issues, even though they're facing, in many ways, some of the most sustained pressure that they ever have, whether that be international public opinion or, sort of just the security pressures that they're now facing. And so I'm curious how you sort of reevaluate that argument in light of where we are today in terms of what could, change this reality, especially within the Israeli public.
Yeah.
Can you summarize the argument so everyone gets it?
Yeah. So my first book, The Only Language They Understand, looks at basically every Israeli territorial withdrawal and examines how it came about. Why did it come about? And what I show is that they were all done coercively. They were all done as a result of diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, threats, and violence. And so, what I see over the last year is, although it's true that there have been moves toward greater pressure on Israel, but these are tiny little baby steps. These tiny little baby steps toward accountability. What I really see for Israel is total impunity during this last year. I see a carte blanche from the United States as Israel is demolishing Gaza and now expanding into Lebanon, and who knows what's coming tomorrow. And so I do believe that the incentive can change for Israel if we actually reach a point where there are real costs. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're even close to being there yet. And I also believe that it doesn't really matter this whole, public opinion polling left and right. People are going to act in their rational self-interest. And at the end of the day, it's going to be whether you're left or you're right or whatever. I want to be in FIFA. I want to be in the Olympics. I want to travel to Europe without a visa. I want to travel to the United States without a visa. I want to be able to operate a normal business. I don't want to live in a pariah state. I don't want to hide that I'm Israeli when I travel abroad and speak in a different language and be afraid to tell taxi drivers where I'm from. And I think that when you get to that point, then there's a rational interest, even if you're very right wing, to say, I want to have a different reality, and this is the price I have to pay.
Second to last question.
Yeah, thank you for being here as well. Sorry. As you were speaking, it was announced that Iran fired, quote, dozens of missiles towards Israel. Clearly, as you were speaking earlier, this wasn't unanticipated, but how do you see this playing out, and how do you think that narratives from the media and the global community will shape what's about to happen?
I mean, Sarah Leah
Yeah.
was just speaking about this.
Yeah,
earlier.
I mean, I'd like to actually see what these missiles were, and we need to see a lot more. I mean, I think we saw, for example, after the attack on Iranian diplomatic facility in Damascus, the Iranians had to respond and launched some attacks on Israel. After the murder of Haniyeh in Iran again, the Iranians were supposed to respond. I don't think they actually did. And now, you know, with this massive assault in Lebanon, everyone is waiting to see, is Iran going to respond? Now, the Iran experts I've talked to said what Iran will try to do is do some kind of a face-saving attack so that they can say they attacked, but quickly pull back, because obviously, I think they don't want a bigger war, much as they will be fairly well demolished, severely hurt and harmed, just because of the inequity in arms that we're looking at. I mean, the global superpower of the United States would be part of that equation. So, yeah, I think it's going to get worse.
Last question here is from our online participants. Could any of you speak and say something more about the role of the U.S. arms industry in the special relationship between the United States and Israel? What role do they see in terms of their interests as U.S. arm producers like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, et cetera, and others, considering that much of the U.S. aid to Israel must be spent on U.S. arms that are then field tested on Palestinians and Lebanese?
I just wrote an article that touches on this very issue, and the role of the American military-industrial complex doesn't just dictate outcomes that include weapons transfers to Israel, but dictates outcomes that include the most massive weapons dump into the Middle East in global history. And if you count the weapons that the United States has sold to the benefit of Raytheon and General Dynamics and so forth, to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE, to Qatar, to Bahrain, actually Israel would be a smaller portion of that. And I think that they are part of the nefarious, malign incentive structure in our government throughout the Middle East, which rewards administrations that continue to sell weapons, not just gift them, to sell weapons to the Middle East and to maintain America's status as the biggest arms merchant in the world, and punishes administrations and officials who don't. Now, remember, Biden came in as a candidate promising to end weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. That didn't last 2 minutes. You know, the pressure was just overwhelming. It's unbearable in terms of the donors, including the military-industrial complex donors, who are able to pull the strings of government officials to keep the spigots of weapon flowing.
You want to comment on that?
What she said.
What she said. Well, that brings this event to a close. Let me just thank both Nathan and Sarah, not only for your analytical clarity, but for your moral clarity. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances, but you know, we're at a university. Our job is education, and I like to think that we
made some headway today in educating our audience and our online viewers on this topic. Before I end, Nathan's books are sold here in the room. I think he might stay behind for a few moments and sign a few. And tonight at 6 o'clock at Busboys and Poets downtown, I believe at 450 K Street, if I'm not mistaken, he'll be having a book event. And Sarah Leah Whitson will be back on campus in roughly a week for our panel discussion that marks the first anniversary of the October 7th attack and the war. And the war in Gaza. And that's the poster right there for our next event, featuring 4 speakers, including Sarah Leah Whitson. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Hope to see you again.